Hello, I'm Hannah Kay, and welcome to this Intelligence Squared event with Yascha Mounk. There are various ways in which you can get involved. You can ask questions, join in the audience chat, and tweet us using the hashtag IQ2. And on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a link where you can get a copy of Yascha's new book, The Identity Trap, a story of ideas and power in our time. And it's a brilliant account of giving the intellectual roots of current ideas about sex, race, and gender, and a valiant plea for liberal and universal values. But now I'm delighted to hand over to our chair. He is the author and critic, Tomiwa Owolade. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Hannah. Tonight's event is going to run for about 1 hour. For the first 45 minutes or so, I'm going to be in conversation with Yascha. And then, after that, I'm going to be taking your questions. You can start asking them now by clicking on the Ask Question button under the video screen and typing in your question. If you want your name to be mentioned, type it into the box, then press send. You could also take part in the conversation on Twitter. All you need to do is to tweet us using the hashtag IQ2. Now, Yascha, the very first question I want to ask you is that with the current war in Ukraine, with Israel's conflict with Gaza, with the climate crisis, do you think writing about identity issues is a distraction from what some people might consider the more salient issues affecting us in the world today?
Well, thanks for that question. And I don't think it is. I like to say that I'm a democracy crisis hipster. I've been worried about the crisis of democracy since before it was cool. I made my name in books like The People versus Democracy, warning about the rise of populism, especially, if not exclusively, on the right, and what it would do to our democratic systems. And I remain very concerned about that. I'm coming to you virtually. I'm sad not to be able to be in person with everybody from New York City. And Donald Trump is running neck to neck with Joe Biden in polls for the 2024 elections, and I'm worried about that too. So why write a book about what I see as the threat from a misguided set of ideas about race, gender, and sexual orientation that has grown up on the left, on the part of the political spectrum to which I myself belong over the course of the last decade? Well, I think these ideas are a trap, which is to say that there's a lure, there's something that is appealing to people, that promises to make the world better. The ideology claims that it is what allows people in the most principled, radical, uncompromising possible way to con the injustices that undoubtedly persist in our societies.
Mm,
But I think it is a trap, as we've started to see in the last years. It's a trap that makes it much harder for progressive institutions to actually serve their important missions. It is a trap that, in key public policy decisions, leads us astray, makes it harder for us to actually find solutions that will gain broad support and that'll make the world a better place. I think it actually encourages in our politics and in our culture a zero
mm,
sum conflict
mm,
between different ethnic and other identity groups, which is going to make it much harder to sustain our political systems. And as a result, it's a chimera to think that you need to prioritize between fighting right wing populism and fighting this ideology. Donald Trump's victory in 2016 was one of the reasons why it became very hard to criticize these ideas on the left, especially in the United States, because it was easy to accuse you of being a traitor who was running interference for Trump. But it's the hold of these ideas over so many mainstream institutions and over so much of the left and over parts of the Democratic Party, which helps to explain
mm,
why Trump is continuing to do very well in polls for 2024. And I'd like to note here the contrast, whatever people might like or dislike about Keir Starmer, with the United Kingdom, where a Labour leader who has drawn a very clear line of division between himself and the left is running
mm,
20 points ahead in the poll. I think that that is a
mm,
related phenomenon. And finally, I'd just like
mm,
to say that the last weeks should have made it very obvious how badly wrong these ideas can go. The conflict in the Middle
mm,
East is very complicated.
mm,
It does have a long history. I can understand that people's sympathies may lie more of one side or the other. Hopefully, they lie to some extent with civilian victims on both sides. But the unwillingness and the inability of big parts of the left in the last weeks to acknowledge the sheer scale and brutality of a terrorist attack that Hamas perpetrated, killing over 1,400 civilians. The fact that big parts of the left movement in the United States, including the Democratic Socialists for America and chapters of Black Lives Matter, actively celebrated this slaughter, idolized the paragliders who killed over 250 people at that music festival. That I think is absolutely part and parcel of the topic of my book, because it is when you start to see the world through simplistic identity categories, thinking that you can understand a conflict like that in the Middle East as simply pitting whites versus people of color, colonizers versus the colonized, and so on, that you end up with that kind of deep moral lack of clarity.
Thank you. In what ways has your own personal background as a German Jewish person shaped the writing of this book?
Well, I mean, I think part of my book is to argue that we should be reluctant to define ourselves too much by our own identities, which does not, of course, mean that we need to deny them or that I'm unaware of the fact that that's shaped me in certain ways, as I'm sure it has shaped you in certain ways. But I really worry when many of our social practices today encourage a kind of personal identity trap. I've talked about the political elements of this trap very briefly, and perhaps we can delve into it more in the conversation. But at a personal level, I think if you're teaching students, as many schools now do, that the way to really find recognition and belonging in the world is to conceive of yourselves primarily by the specific intersection of identities in which you belong, that sets you up for failure in that important endeavor. Most of us do want some form of social belonging, some form of social recognition, but I will never fully feel that recognition if I'm treated in an identical way to my brother, even though my brother has a very similar identity to me. And so I think part of that is a personal recognition that is not what I want to be seen for in the world and what I want to be defined as in the world, certainly not from the outside. There's some other things here, right? One of them is that growing up in Germany, I experienced some outright anti-Semitism. I also experienced a good amount of somewhat creepy philo-Semitism. Germans who wanted to prove to me that they're so sorry for the past and so ashamed of the Third Reich, that they love the Jews. And this took all kinds of absurd forms at the time. This would be more controversial now. It was people telling me how much they love Woody Allen movies, or ask me whether I speak Hebrew and how beautiful the Hebrew language is. I don't speak a word of Hebrew, right? And I always realized that didn't help me at all to feel like an equal. It made me feel patronized, and like it was actually harder for me to develop a truly German identity. And now, one of the strange things that's happened when I moved to the United States is that I went from being a representative of sort of the seminal group of victims in the country, which is to say Jews, to a representative of a seminal group of perpetrators, which is to say white men. And at this point, white middle-aged men. And in certain social situations, I came to feel an expectation that I should act in ways or treat people in ways that I hated being treated as in Germany. And so perhaps if there is a link, it is my recognition that some of those social customs that are now being embraced are deeply antithetical to equality. One of the, in the book, I talk about the more serious progenitors of what I'm calling the identity synthesis. But I also talk about some of their popularizers. People like Robin DiAngelo, who is one of the best-selling authors in the United States and in the United Kingdom in 2020. And DiAngelo, a white woman who makes a lot of money as a diversity trainer, says that every time a white person interrupts a black person, they're bringing the entire apparatus of white supremacy to bear on them. Right? That, first of all, tells me that she doesn't have black friends, because
Yeah.
part of what it is to have friends is that you sometimes interrupt each other. But
Yeah.
secondly, it's precisely this sort of, in a social situation, in a strange
Mm,
way, uh,
mm,
trying to prove to each other how aware you are
mm.
of the identity and sort of being
Yeah.
over. That's exactly what I hated experiencing in Germany, and
Mm,
I think that has
mm,
informed my worries
mm,
about people like Dianti as
mm.
not being a good guide for how we create
Yeah.
real social equality in Britain or the United
Mm.
States or elsewhere today.
Yeah, fantastic. Um, why do you use the term identity synthesis in your book rather than identity politics or woke politics or even cultural Marxism, as like some people do?
Yeah. So one of the strange things about this ideology is that we really don't have a term that's uncontroversial that we can
Mm,
use as a basis for serious debate, right? Um,
mm,
some people in Britain consider themselves socialists. Some people don't like the idea of socialism at all, but all of them can agree to refer to a broad body of ideas that has some internal tensions, but that is, recognizably uh, an, an ideology that hangs together as socialist, right? Um, I think we now have a new ideology that has become dominant on the left, an ideology that puts ideas about the role that identity plays in the world and the role that identity should play in the world at the very basis of our political thinking. But we don't have a coherent term for it. Woke is the most recognizable term. It used to be a self-description, right? Activists proudly called themselves woke 5 or 6 years ago. But now it's become such a term of opprobrium that when you talk about woke this and woke that, you sort of just sound like an old man shouting at the clouds. And I think it makes it harder to have a serious debate. Identity politics, I think, is a little bit too broad. Frederick Douglass in the United States and Martin Luther King, or some of the key members of the civil rights movement, or the gay rights movement, have also engaged in what might be called forms of identity politics. But because what they were asking for was inclusion in a set of universal institutions, was to live up to the promise of these long-standing rules. I actually am inspired by them and agree with them on many things. My concern is about an ideology that explicitly stands in opposition to these ideas.
mm,
Says, as Derek Bell, the founder of critical race theory, said, that we should
mm,
reject the quote unquote
mm.
defunct racial equality ideology of the civil rights movement. So identity
Yeah.
politics for me is too broad. And cultural
Mm,
Marxism, the third possibility you mentioned, simply is misdescribing the
mm,
nature of the phenomenon.
mm,
So the
mm,
idea here is that
mm,
you take something like the Marxist tradition, you
mm,
take out economic categories like social class, and you put in these identity categories like race and gender and
mm,
sexual orientation. Now, the first
mm.
problem with this is that I just don't think there's enough left. In America, I say that it's a little bit like taking the bat out of baseball. I guess here I'd have to say it's
Yeah.
like taking the bat out of cricket or the ball out of football. Or,
Mm,
doesn't work quite as well. But there's just not enough meat left on the ideology once you take economic categories out. And as a matter
mm,
of intellectual history, it turns out to be wrong to think that these ideas originate in Marx and Adorno and Horkheimer, and other people like that. That is just not, when I started to read the intellectual history, what turned out to be the true story. So I call it the identity synthesis simply because
mm,
it is a synthesis of different intellectual influences, which I
mm,
locate in modernism and postcolonialism and critical race
mm,
theory, and it is
mhm,
centrally about the role that identity plays in our society. But as Freddie de Boer, the American author, has said, I don't care what you call it, just tell me what I'm allowed to call it so we can have a serious
mm.
discussion about it. If you want to call it the thing, let's call it the thing.
Fantastic. To what extent do you think this new identity synthesis, as you put it, and the conflict between this and the kind of liberalism that you espouse, to what extent do you think that conflict is an intergenerational conflict?
Um, so it may have elements of a generational conflict. Certainly, we often see that new ideas spread, as Thomas Kuhn pointed out, in the structure of scientific
Mm.
revolutions through a kind of process of generational change. But I think it would be a very big mistake to assume that older people aren't tempted by these ideas, or that
Mm.
young people invariably end up embracing them. I think one of the big reasons why these ideas have been able to gain so much influence so quickly is that many older people who are in charge of institutions did not have a courage of their convictions and actually became semi-converts to this new ideology,
Mm.
or at least thought of this
Mm.
new ideology as sufficiently aligned with their own that they were not able to recognize how it undermined some of the other core commitments, and would land us in this trap
Mm.
where we're talking about today. And among younger generations, it is a minority, and not
Mm.
necessarily ethnic or religious minority, but an ideological
Mm.
minority
Mm. Mm.
that really embraces these ideas. There may also be, and it's too early to say this with confidence, and so I've never written about this. There may also be starting to be pushback among the youngest people. When I look, at students I had 4 or 5 years ago, very excited by these ideas. They were true believers. They really thought this is what's going to allow them to remake the world. When I look at the students I have now at university, they're deeply steeped in these ideas. They've been told from when they're 6 years old that this is how they should see the world. Often they've been raised in accordance with the social practices inspired by these ideologies. Many of my students now have been part of mandatory racially segregated affinity groups, where often teachers came into the classroom as early as when we're 8 or 7 or 6, and said, if you're black, you go over there, and if you're Asian American, you go over there, and if you're Latino, you go over there, and if you're white, you go to a fourth classroom. So they're kind of growing up with this atmosphere, but in part as a result, they see its flaws. They've seen classmates of theirs cancelled over supposed microaggressions when they were 12 or 13. They've had countless lectures and trainings about all of these ideas and concepts, and many of them therefore don't find it exciting. Think of it as what the adults are telling them, and so on. So I think the generational question is hard. What's much clearer is the question of social class, which is to say that the best studies we have in the United States, in Britain, and other places show that the people who really buy into these ideas, the people who are more in common, in one study has called sort of progressive activists, who roughly correspond to the views I'm talking about, are disproportionately white, disproportionately affluent, and disproportionately highly educated.
Fantastic. Um, what would you say to those that argue that the desire for the identity synthesis is shaped by the fact that many people want a sense of belonging, which would have in the past been expressed through affiliation to religion, affiliation to being a member of a political party, affiliation to being a member of a local civic institution. And of the decline of institutional religion, the decline of party political membership, the decline of civic local institutions, where should people go to seek a sense of belonging?
Yeah, I think that's right. When I was at university, I probably assumed that the process of secularization, which was continuing to advance in already very secular societies like Britain, where I was at university, and the continent where I grew up, but also in the United States, which is sort of behind the curve, but increasingly looks like it's simply 30 years later. But the development looks quite similar, actually. Though it's going to be a good thing, right? That religion had often inspired hatred, conflict, mutual dehumanization, as we're seeing in the world right now again, and that societies becoming less and less religious would make them more and more tolerant, would allow us to see what we have in common more. I think we're seeing in the United States in particular that this has turned out to be a very mixed blessing. But a lot of the people who no longer go to church every Sunday find their belonging in extreme online communities, or simply become so lonely, so withdrawn from any genuine social ties, that they're much more vulnerable to extremist appeals. That helps to explain the rise of people like Donald Trump, but I think it also helps to explain some of what we're seeing on the left. I disagree with the very insightful and smart American commentator John McWhorter, who thinks that what he calls wokeism is literally a religion, but it literally should be thought of as a religion. I don't think that's true. I think it has the characteristics of a political ideology that are shared by many different political ideologies. And things like Marxism were not a religion, even though some of their adherents might have had a sort of form of religious fervor. But what's certainly true is that it's speaking to a deeply religious and in some ways specifically Puritan moral imaginary. When Europeans look at America, they sometimes imagine that Puritanism continues to have a hold because of because society is relatively more religious. But I think that the shape of Puritan ideology has as much hold in communities around Harvard University, where I've lived for a long time, for example, than it does in the South or the Midwest. The substance of the beliefs they hold are very different. They don't believe in the kind of um, constraints and morality and so on the ancestors believed in, even though they actually mostly lead very conventional, quote unquote, bourgeois lives. Um, but certainly, sort of once they are out of their mid 20s and settle down and get married and have children and so on, much more so than in Europe. Um, but when it comes to the need to live in a morally pure and clean community, and the ways in which people who are suspected of befouling that purity are cast out, I think that the people whose uh, propositional views at a superficial level have least similarity to the Puritan ancestors actually are the inheritors of a Puritan moral imagination to a remarkable extent.
Great. What is Tumblr, and what is the significance of Tumblr in shaping the identity synthesis?
Yeah, so in the book, it has four parts, right? And the first part really tells the intellectual history of where these ideas come from, explaining how thinkers like Michel Foucault and Edward Said and Gayatri Spivak and Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw together developed a set of ideas that provided the ground material uh, for what has become the identity synthesis, or what has become, if you prefer the term, wokeness. And that's a very interesting and funny story. It's a slightly surprising story. I think many of the people who developed those ideas came to regret it, would not like the ideology in its modern shape. But that's how intellectual history often works. And then the second part of the book, I go on to ask, well, how is it that in about 2010, those ideas had started to be very influential on university campuses, on parts of the academy, but they really continue to be marginal to society as a whole. Kimberly Crenshaw, in a paper sort of reflecting on the 20th anniversary of critical race theory, said, we've it's great, we've had good careers, we've established our position in universities, and that's all nice and well, but we are not going to have much influence on society. In fact, this guy, Barack Obama, just got elected, and his basic political philosophy is fundamentally at odds with the key tenets of critical race theory, something that people who think that critical race theory is simply sort of nice liberalism should remember. Um, and therefore, our prospect for influence in the world has gotten even more remote. Well, over the next 10 years, I think her influence ended up surprising Crenshaw and many of the other theorists that were part of this movement. It started to really be popularized, be repackaged in a way that could go viral and could not just become very popular among a subsection of young people, but could exert tremendous influence on politics and our mainstream institutions. And Tumblr, I think, is a key part of that story. It is one of the first social media platforms, a microblogging platform, as it was known at the time. It had a lot of teenage users, as well as some in the early 20s. It allowed a great variety of forms of content, from text to photos to memes to short videos. And it allowed, crucially, a form of self-tagging, self-discovery, where you could put on some kind of label, which often became an identity label, and then search for others that shared that. And the way this worked out is that it greatly expanded how people could identify themselves. When you think about identity formation in an analog world, you really need to find a bunch of people who agree with you on your identity for it to be meaningful. And if you're going to a school, then that meant that you needed to find 10 people in your local school that shared that kind of identity. And so that limited the possible range of identities to ones that had, about 1% of the population. Otherwise, you just wouldn't find enough people to co-create at that crucial moment. Well, Tumblr, because of this tagging mechanism, which was new at the time, just blew that constraint out of the water, and it became the place where many of the identity labels that have had a broader career since came to be experimented with, including many of the gender labels, but also new forms of sexual orientation, like demisexual. All of that originated on Tumblr. And then when you started having these tribes where everybody defined themselves by these new identity labels and you had to interact somehow, you needed an ideology that holds those interactions together, a kind of meta ideology. And that came to be where you started to think about microaggressions and the dangers they pose, about the fact that when you offend somebody, it matters that that was the outcome, not what your intent was. Um, and it also started to take on some of the sort of viral expressions that helped proselytize this ideology. And through a few transformations in the written form in places like Ford Catalog and everydayfeminism.com, and then some technological changes which favored content which could spread on social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook along identity lines. These ideas surprisingly quickly entered a broader mainstream audience.
Just a reminder that you can ask a question by clicking on the Ask Question button under the video and then pressing send. You could also take part on social media by using the hashtag IQ2. Yascha, to what extent are the mainstream media also responsible for the identity synthesis? In the book, you mentioned the increase of terms like white privilege and structural racism in the New York Times and in the Washington Post over the past 10 years.
Yeah, I think this is an important part of the story, and in a way, I was just where we're letting off, right? So it's remarkable how quickly these ideas came to be influential in mainstream news organizations. And there's two pathways for this. The first is part of a wider instance of what I'm calling the short march through the institutions, which is to say that by about 2010, so many people were being schooled in these ideas in elite universities in particular, that they started to transform the workplaces into which they fanned out. And the second is that social media algorithms really favored certain kinds of first person stories rooted in genuine experiences and sometimes less persuasive claims of victimhood. When the website Vox.com, which became influential very quickly, was founded, a majority of the traffic to this website came from people who went to the homepage, right? Who typed in Vox.com into the web browser and said, "Is there anything there that I want to read?" That favored content which would appeal to most of a publication's readers. So a publication might have a kind of profile, more left-leaning, more right-leaning, but each article had to appeal to a broad cross-section of its usual readers. By about 2015, 2016, the distribution mechanism had changed in such a way that most of the traffic came from Facebook or Twitter. And people on Facebook or Twitter often connected to others who share an identity category. And so suddenly these first-person stories about, the experiences I had growing up as a German Jew or growing up as an Asian American or, as a disabled, whatever, right? Those could spread along those social media networks in new ways. That's where the clicks were. And so suddenly, if you went back to that website in 2017, 2018, the form of it had changed from a sort of more analytical frame to a much more first personal frame. And the politics had changed along with it. It had become a lot about these experiences of discrimination and really putting them at the center of a worldview. And at the time, the New York Times and the Washington Post were in deep financial crisis, which at least the Times is no longer. But this is the moment when the print revenue was cratering, when the ad revenue from print was cratering. They had not yet built up this massive base of online subscribers that now sustains them. And so they were desperate for clicks. And so they hired a lot of writers that were most adapted to this game. And so I do think that these publications ended up sharing a bunch of responsibility for bad ideas being mainstreamed in two ways. First, they published stuff that I think was just quite extreme, right? I mean, one op-ed in particular that I'm thinking of in the New York Times was by an African American writer saying, "I'm teaching my kids not to be friends with white people because you can never trust white people, and I don't want them to be friends with white people effectively." I mean, it's a little bit more subtle than that, but it's the core of the message. I just think that's a irresponsible thing for something like the New York Times to publish. They're free to do so. I just think that is not where the majority of the audience was. It is not what most Americans or most people in Britain believe. It just gives an indication of how wide they opened the doors to content that would have, for good reason, I think, been considered quite niche or fringe in previous iterations. And then the other thing that happened is that there were certain champions of these ideas that effectively came to be beyond criticism. People like Robin DiAngelo and particularly Ibram X. Kendi, who argued for a very Manichaean view of what we call anti-racism. According to Kendi, everything is either racist or anti-racist. So our conversation is either racist or anti-racist. But this pair of scissors I'm holding is either racist or anti-racist. Football is either racist or anti-racist. Right? There's no middle category. It's surprisingly similar to George W. Bush's claim after 9/11 that you're either with us or against us. But it was widely embraced and celebrated. And I know from many journalists at newspapers and magazines in the United States who wanted to write robust critiques of Kendi's ideas and of the big Center for Anti-Racism that he started at Boston University with tens of millions of dollars in funding, and who were told in no uncertain terms that this was not publishable, that it would be too controversial to criticize those ideas. That started to change a little bit. Kendi fired most of his staff and does not seem to have delivered on any of the promises he made his funders. And there was a scandal big enough that suddenly the floodgates have opened. And now you're seeing more critical examination both of that actual institution and of his broader ideas. But for a good number of years, mainstream publications just didn't want to go there. And that, I think, is really worrying. It's worrying about the state of our public sphere and public opinion, and it helps to explain the decline of trust in these institutions. I have, over the course of the last years, had so many conversations in Britain, in the United States, in continental Europe, with influential people who say something like the sort of things we've been saying in this conversation today, and then add, "Of course, I would never say this publicly." And people aren't idiots. They feel that. They know that the people in charge of institutions say one thing to each other and another thing to the public. And so why should they trust them, or why should they trust us? Because, you and I at this point are part of those institutions.
Yeah. What do you make of the idea, which is expressed by the political scientist Adolf Reed? And Reed argues that many of these social movements dedicated to gender, race, sexual orientation are simply an extension of neoliberalism. They are a way for many corporations to justify pre-existing inequalities. So a corporation can say, well, 50% of the people on our board are women, 10% are black people, without saying anything about economic inequality. What do you make of that argument?
So, since we're talking about identity, one of my identities is as a political scientist. And as a political scientist, I love a good 2x2, a simple matrix where you have 4 quadrants. And I genuinely think this is a 2x2 situation, which is to say that if you have on one axis people who are on the far left and people who are on the center left. And you have on the other axis people who are woke and people who are not woke. I genuinely think that there's people in all four of those quadrants. So there are people who are non-woke center lefties, which is broadly what I would consider myself. Then I think there's woke center lefties who, love the diversity initiatives at their corporations, who are super fans of D'Angelo and Kendi, but who also, want to become CFO of their Fortune 500 company. But then I think there's also, a divide on the far left, and there's certainly people on the revolutionary left who are woke, who embrace these ideas in a serious way, and then there's people like Adolf Reed, who's a self-described Marxist, who probably would happily call himself as being on the far left, certainly economically, but who are really critical of these ideas. So I think it's a little bit more complicated than he points out in that kind of way. I think it's true that there is, I think sort of there is a deep tension within people who embrace the identity synthesis between those who think that you need to overthrow our political and our economic system in order to be true to its ideas. And that's certainly what the founders of these ideas, including people like Derek Bell, would have believed. But then I think there are people who want to incorporate these concerns into a capitalist system and are otherwise quite politically moderate. Now, what I will say is that what Reed's point, and I cite him extensively in my book because I find his work to be very insightful, helps to explain is why so many big corporations could get on board with the program. Why is it that they all put D'Angelo and Kendi on their reading lists? Why is it that Coca-Cola Company mandated its employees to take a training in which one of the slides was how to be less white, which turned out to be just straight up racist things, not racist against white people, but racist against non-white people, like, don't care so much about punctuality and worship of a written word and all of those supposedly white virtues, which clearly are, character traits of all kinds of human beings, irrespective of the group into which they were born. Why were they able to embrace these ideas so quickly? Well, because, as Adolf Reed points out, the idea of equity is compatible with the idea of deep economic inequality. Equity focuses our attention on economic disparities between ethnic or racial groups. That's why Reed calls it race disparitarianism. But this suggests that we could have a just society if only in the United States, where about 13% of the population is black, about 13% of billionaires were black. And you could come up with the equivalent figures for the United Kingdom. In fact, I think we may get to something like racial equity in the United States, but by a rather bizarre route, which is to say, and I know this is a topic that interests you in some ways, and you've written about this interestingly in your book. You have very, very successful black immigrants to the United States. Many of them from countries like Kenya and Nigeria and so on. And then you have, a black population that has done quite well in the last decades, that has really risen into the middle class in many cases, but that does continue to suffer from disproportionate poverty and disadvantage, who are descendants of American slavery. And one of the ways in which you might quite plausibly get to equity in the United States is that the kids in deeply deprived and dysfunctional schools on the south side of Chicago, in the bad neighborhoods of Baltimore, in the certain parts of the Bronx or of Brooklyn, continue to be really disadvantaged. But you also have sufficient high-skilled immigration from booming sub-Saharan African countries that on average a black person is going to earn as well as a white person, or have as much wealth as a white person in 50 or 100 years. But if this is a strange amalgam of people who've immigrated and who outperform white Americans, and people who continue to suffer these real disadvantages from the legacy of slavery, it's unclear how much we've actually succeeded in overcoming the injustices of American history. So here too, this racist puritan framework fails in ways that somebody like Reed would point out, and I would agree with him.
Yeah, fantastic. And speaking of America, to what extent do you think the identity synthesis is a particularly American phenomenon? And what lessons do you think your book would provide to people in the UK, for example, in Europe, or the rest of the world?
Well, again, I think your book is really brilliant at pointing out that when people in Britain now talk about race in particular, they speak in an American accent, and so I think those ideas are very influential in this idea, but they're also very influential in other areas. They're influential when it comes to gender, which obviously has been a very significant debate in the United Kingdom, and they structure increasingly ideas about how we should educate children in the United Kingdom as well. I was struck. This is not. I don't want to call King Charles woke. I think that may be an overstatement. But I was struck that he recently said that we should think of the United Kingdom as a community of communities, which I think is a very significant error. Now, of course, a country like the United Kingdom will have many communities within it. And in fact, one of the things I love about London or other parts of the UK is its great diversity, and is the fact that many of the people who have origins all over the world continue to speak the language of their ancestors, continue to be proud of many of the elements of cultural heritage of the ancestors, perhaps are more likely to be friends with or to marry members of those groups. All of that is fine. All of that is part of what makes Britain great. But we also need to have a self-understanding as people who are not defined by those groups. We also need people who strike up friendships and business partnerships and perhaps romantic relationships with members of different groups. We must not stereotype people into being defined by the groups into which they were born, in part because many will have very uncertain belonging in those, because they might have one parent from one group or another parent from another group, or because there might be Somali Muslims who, in a simplistic scheme, will be seen just as Muslims, but who actually experience significant discrimination within the Muslim community based on their religious faith. The idea of a community of communities is very dangerous in that respect, and I was struck by the fact that somebody like King Charles could embrace it. That too is part of the broader set of concerns that I outlined. So I think Britain is half a step behind the United States here. I think there's more of an opportunity to sidestep some of the worst ideas of this. I am heartened that Britain also has a left that is inflected by some of these ideas, but that at least in its institutional representation in the Labour Party has also recognized that it needs to draw a line to the most extreme manifestation of these ideas. But that doesn't mean that this intellectual battle is not going to come to the United Kingdom. I think it is going to structure intellectual life in the United States, in Britain, in much of the European continent, in Australia, and possibly in parts of Asia, in the kinds of ways in which the fight over Marxism did for many decades in the second half of the 20th century. And so it's time to understand where these ideas come from, understand how they became so influential, to learn how to critique the main application of these ideas, as I do in my book, on areas like whether we can understand each other if we stand at different intersections of identities, which I believe we can, on areas like where we should put forms of mutual cultural influence between groups under a general pole of suspicion, invoking the label of cultural appropriation, which I think is a mistake, reflecting on why we need a genuine culture of free speech, why, as we briefly touched on, we should be skeptical of equity as a value that can supersede the important value of equality. And so I hope to provide people with the vocabulary and the framework for pushing back against those ideas in my book.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Yascha. Now for the audience Q&A. I've got a question from Reina de Paula in Sao Paulo. And this question is, what if there is a natural, insurmountable limit to our acceptance of diversity? What if any minor difference is enough to segregate other people? I think the sort of the line that the question is trying to go for is, say that we become And this is something I've thought about a lot. Say that we become, say, a post-racial society, as thinkers like Thomas Chatton Williams often argues. Wouldn't there be something else to replace race as a category to divide people? Is there a sort of natural human instinct towards division?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I agree that psychologically there's something like that. So I follow people like Jonathan Haidt in arguing that human beings are by nature groupish. And there's some really strong social psychology to suggest this. One of his studies was carried out in the United Kingdom in the 1960s. Um, Henri Teifel was trying to figure out, reflecting on the Holocaust and World War II, how it is that members of different groups can come to be, wonderfully altruistic and courageous in helping members of their own group, but also often cruel, violent, sometimes horrific in the treatment of members of the outgroup. And he said, look, I'm going to create groups that are so trivial, that are so devoid of meaning, that they're not going to have those tendencies. And then I can ladle on additional features, and that'll help us to understand what makes groups tick this way. And he got a bunch of kids in Bristol into the lab, and he showed them a sheet of paper with 150 dots on them. And he said, how many dots are on this sheet of paper? And they made a guess. And then he divided them into a group of overestimators and underestimators and had them play some basic distribution games. And to his surprise, it turned out that the overestimators started to discriminate against the underestimators, and the underestimators started to discriminate against the overestimators. So, and this was later recreated in lots of different ways. I recreated sometimes in my classroom by asking my kids, who are super diverse, who think themselves as the most tolerant people in the world, whether or not a hot dog is a sandwich. And at the end of a little bit of discussion and debate, the kids who think that a hot dog is a sandwich start to discriminate against the kids who think that a hot dog is not a sandwich. So, yes, the in-group, out-group mechanism is absolutely fundamental to humans. It'll always rear its head. In part for that reason, diverse societies will always have different communities within them, will always have different tribes within them, and that's fine. I have no problem with the fact that people will have those subnational forms of identity. But that makes it all the more important for our institutions, for our social norms, for our values to push against that. If you, as so many schools in America now do, have as your goal of your education to make children think of themselves as racial beings, to own the racial identity, you may be trying, especially when it comes to the white kids, to create Kendi style anti racists, people who will denounce the white privilege, but you're much more likely to create racists and white supremacists. You're much more likely to create people who are going to say, if this is the most important identity I have, then I should push against others. So the thing that can help diverse societies succeed is the fact that how we conceive of ourselves is malleable, even if a tendency to favor an in-group over the out-group is not, and B, that we can have multiple identities. That's why we need to encourage a healthy form of patriotism. That's why we need to put people in sports teams where they can come to see that they have things in common, where we can cooperate across the lines that might divide them in society, not into racially segregated affinity groups where you're doubling down on the dividing lines that already structure our society.
Great, thank you, Yasha. I've also got a question from Libby, and Libby asks, do you think that the excessive individualism promoted by liberalism provoked an inevitable backlash in the urge to construct groups based on a shared sense of identity and victimhood?
These are great questions. So it depends a little bit on how you define liberalism in this context. I think that people sometimes misunderstand what the basic principles of liberalism consist in. Liberalism is not telling you to go and cut your ties with all of your family members at 18 and move to another country and have a radical life of self-exploration. That is one of the options that you have in a free society. But the basic moral and political principles of liberalism are not telling you that this is a better, more meaningful, superior way to live. In fact, liberalism stems from the recognition of the importance of the ties that people have to their communities and the deep importance that they ascribe to things like religion. The origin of liberalism was an attempt to keep the peace after decades and centuries of religious war, in which having control of a state was a necessary precondition for being able to practice your religion in peace. And so some of the core liberal values and principles are what allows people to have ties to their communities. Freedom of worship, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of movement, all of those things are precisely what you need in order to be able to sustain communities. So I think liberalism, rightly understood, rejects a perfectionist liberalism where everybody like Tomiwa and I should be, a writer thinking about the world. And I know that's true of you, but it's somewhat true of me, living a somewhat deracinated existence in different countries and traveling a lot and so on. That's one of the options you have, but there's nothing wrong for a liberal with somebody who continues to live in their town, in their village, continues to have strong religious beliefs, continues to honor the ties of family and kinship into which they were born. And nothing in my book suggests that these are a problem as well. But if society starts to define you purely by virtue of where you were born, if we start getting into a communitarianism, which says that you don't have rights and duties as a citizen, but rather merely as a member of a particular community within that national communities, if we start to embrace social norms that don't try to get us to recognize what we have in common at the same time as having different identities, but rather to double down on the things that already divide us, then we're setting ourselves up for a lot of political trouble.
Great. I've also got a question from Inez, and the question is, why do you think liberal white people have been so ready to identify themselves as group oppressors? And in your book, actually, just to add slightly to Inez's question, you cite the fact that white liberal or progressive people are even more likely to espouse the identity synthesis than Black American people, which I found interesting. Why do you think that is?
That's a great question. I think part of that is a form of elite posturing within that ethnic group, which is to say that it is a way of demonstrating your superior enlightenment relative to the rest of what otherwise might be your own in-group. And one of the things that I find fascinating is, I've been warning about people like Donald Trump for 10 years, and I continue to be very worried about him. But it strikes me that if most Americans say they genuinely don't like Trump, which is true, and yet so many Americans are unwilling to cross the aisle and to vote for the Democratic Party, at some point, perhaps it's time to look in the mirror. At some point, it's time for me and my friends and colleagues who are all on the side of Joe Biden to ask, what is it about us that makes people so angry at us? And part of that is to think about the kind of social role we play and the kind of snobism we have towards others. In the United States, there's this idea about the beer test, because in 2004, more Americans said that they'd like to have a beer with George W. Bush than with John Kerry. And so since people had trouble understanding how Kerry could have lost, they thought that must be it. But that makes no sense to me. Most people know they're never going to have a beer with a president. But what does make sense to me is the inverse beer test. If a president showed up in your home today and you didn't have time to redecorate or to clean up, and you talk to a president like you talk to your friends, would they like you? Would they not like you? And to some extent in Britain, but even more strongly in the United States, it just strikes me that the answer very clearly would be no for most of the people I know and for most politicians in the Democratic Party. That they have more empathy and understanding for people with vastly different views, for rural villages in India, or for supporters of Hamas, may I say, than they do for working class, white, Republican-leaning evangelicals in the Midwest of the American South. And so I think this sort of attempt at differentiation towards the own sort of towards your own compatriots who you see as your real adversaries, who you see as the people who really and truly are morally beyond salvation in a way, but it's not true of anybody else in the world, plays some part in that.
Fantastic. I've got a very good question. I think a great question from Femi. And Femi asks, how can we balance the need for free speech with concerns about hate speech and disinformation, particularly in the age of social media?
So I must admit that I have become mildly allergic to the idea of misinformation. Um, it's one thing to talk about disinformation, which has a
Mm,
technical
mm,
definition as state actors trying
mm,
deliberately through bot armies and so
mm,
on to
mm,
affect public discourse. And I think with free speech for individuals, but not for bots. So I think there you can do something. But misinformation is this very, very broad and vague term which
mm,
covers things that supposedly are wrong or misleading, but that
mm,
has been applied in its brief career to things that turned out to be either seriously worthy of consideration or true. One of the first areas in which misinformation was
mm,
used to stifle a debate was questions about the origin of a COVID virus. The so-called lab leak theory was labeled as misinformation, and not only did the New York Times and the Washington Post and so on not report on it for a very long time, but serious scientists were kicked off Facebook and YouTube for talking about it. I'm still not sure if it's true, but it is now taken seriously as a possible or perhaps even the most likely explanation for the origin of COVID by very serious institutions, including most intelligence agencies in the United States. So I'm a little bit concerned about that. In the last weeks, uh, the BBC and the New York Times and CNN all spread the claim that over 500 people had been killed by an Israeli airstrike at a hospital in Gaza, with huge headlines, with push notifications, and so on. It turned out not only that this was based on one claim by a doctor working for Hamas, but even on apparently a mistranslation of what that doctor said. He had talked about casualties, which can include injured as well as non injured people. And of course, it turned out that according to independent investigations in newspapers, as well as the assessment of various security agencies, very likely this was a misfired rocket from a Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip rather than from Israel. So who was spreading the misinformation there? So I find that term a little bit concerning. But more broadly, to the question of free speech, I think it is very important that we fight not just for the laws of free speech, which are at threat in the United Kingdom, where the criminal law has become very trigger happy in fining and sometimes jailing people for offensive use, but more broadly, a culture of free speech. And here we do have to balance the freedom of association, a core liberal value, against the attempt to push back against the huge power that private companies now have in regulating our lives. And I think that there's a few steps here. The first is to make it impossible for companies to fire people for private political views. The second is to make it impossible for companies to sever business relationship with customers for political reasons. In particular, companies like banks, train companies, airline companies, basic internet service providers that are required to pursue basic functions of life. You should not be able to deny boarding on a plane, and you should not be able to have your bank account canceled because of your political views, no matter how offensive they might be. That's just not the sort of business that those companies should be in making those judgments. And finally, I think we need to push back against some of the hallmarks of quote unquote cancel culture, which go beyond critical culture. You should be very skeptical about collective letters trying to sort of call for somebody's head. You should be very skeptical of secondary boycotts that says, unless you stop associating with this person, I'm going to stop associating with you. These are elements of a culture of fear that's trying to impose invisible lines as to where we can go, which people are free to engage in. I'm not talking in this respect about government regulation against that, because that itself would interfere with our freedom of association. that there are forms of behavior that those of us who care about preserving a genuine culture of free speech should be very reluctant to engage in.
Thank you very much, Yascha, and thank you to all of you for listening to this conversation.
Thank you. This is great.
And thank you so much, Yascha and Tom, for a really brilliant, fascinating, thought-provoking conversation. Once again, here is Yascha's book, The Identity Trap. I do highly recommend it. So now, from all of us at Intelligence Squared, thank you for watching and see you again soon. Good night.